Okay, hello and welcome everybody. Thank you all for joining us for today's webcast with Grameen Foundation. We're so glad to have you here to celebrate with us Women's History Month and especially International Women's Day. For those of you who don't know, International Women's Day is on March 8th and every year has a different theme. This year's theme is Each for Equal. So we're happy to have you here to learn a little bit more about how Grameen Foundation is working to help forge a more gender equal world. So there will be a chance for Q&A at the end of this, but feel free to ask questions throughout the webcast and we will pose them to Bobbi. There's a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, so go ahead and pop a question in there whenever it occurs to you and we'll get to it when it makes the most sense. So for now, I'd like to go ahead and welcome Bobbi Gray, Research Director at Grameen Foundation. We're so excited to hear from you today. So thank you and welcome, Bobbi.
Great, thank you, Kate. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks to my Grameen colleagues for inviting me to present today. Kate, if you want to go ahead and move to the next slide. While the slides are transitioning, I think I'll just start out by sharing that when I started with the organization about 15 years ago, my first trip abroad was to Ghana, and it was actually during International Women's Day in Ghana. During that time, and it was kind of my first exposure to this particular celebration, and all of the women and the men in Accra at that time were all wearing a particular pattern of clothing. All the women had dresses made out that actually said Women's Day, International Women's Day on it. And it's really interesting to see this particular celebration kind of go much more global than I think it was at that particular time. So it's kind of a nice moment to kind of reflect on the amount of time that I've spent with Grameen. And when you count the 15 or the several years prior to the merger of Freedom from Hunger and Grameen Foundation, it's has been quite a journey. So a little bit about myself. I'm research director. So I oversee all of the research and evaluation efforts of Grameen Foundation. I'm based in Texas, and so I have 3 children, a lot of farm animals, and I live approximately 1 hour away from any type of service. And we moved here about 2 years ago. So I have the pleasure of understanding a little bit more and having a little bit more empathy for the people that we serve because of my lack of services out here. I'm actually on satellite internet. So that's why Kate's going to control the PowerPoint, because it's very windy here today. And so I'm a little bit afraid I might lose my internet connection. So I hope you'll have patience with me if the connection happens to go in and out. The picture on the left I want to share now because I'm going to talk a little bit about the 2 ladies in the picture. So back in October, I had the chance to travel to Ghana to work with my colleagues there with a project we have known as Farm Grow. And so this is where we're working to integrate different types of technologies like satellite into a kind of a farmer project where we're helping farmers adopt good agricultural practices. And so the woman on the left, her name is Joyce, and she's a widowed cocoa farmer. And the woman in the center, her name is Benedicta, and she is the agronomist that supports Joyce on her farm. And we had a chance to interview them with, regarding some of their perspective about, the work that we've been doing with them. And so I'll talk a little bit more about them towards the middle part of the presentation. But this just gives you an idea of who I am, but also the 2 ladies I got to spend some time with back in October. So if you'll go ahead and move to the next one. So as we kind of think about International Women's Day, I wanted to talk a little bit about just the potential of the global market in women, because many of us, as we're doing our day-to-day job, spend a lot of time thinking about local context, what women are specifically doing economically, the challenges that they're having. But I think it's helpful to pull back sometimes and actually think about just the global potential and what that means for the work that we're doing. So in 2018, it was estimated that women controlled approximately $40 trillion in annual consumer spending globally. And this has doubled since 2009. In 2009, Harvard Business Review put out a really nice article called The Female Economy, where they kind of laid out this case for, businesses doing a much better job at serving women. And the research shows that women make approximately 70 to 80% of all consumer purchases globally. And so even for the types of women, that Grameen serves in the low income bracket, where we're very concerned about their decision-making power, what you learn when you, look through this data is that despite, their limited decision-making power in some contexts, they actually have quite a bit of influence and power over what purchases get made at the household level. This can look like, for example, a woman going to the market to do kind of some price checking for her husband on, if he's looking for a new shirt. She may come back and say, there's these two options. Which one do you want? And she may be the one to actually go to the market to make those purchases. Women make most of the food and clothing purchases for themselves and for their families. And so this is really a significant market segment that has been underserved for many years. Women represent a larger growth market than China and India combined. And so despite the fact that, even in the United States, there's still a call for, financial services companies and car companies to do a much better job at thinking about women as a market. A lot of them don't look at this market very seriously. And when they do, there are often missteps made where they think, by making a product pink or creating a special space for women, that this will be attractive. And women really want to be seen as serious consumers and customers. And so there's a lot of room for improvement in the way that women are served, whether you're working at the level that Grameen is working or you're working at the level of a national company based in the United States. And so if you can move to the next one, Kate. But despite this potential of the growth market, there are still challenges that women face in reaching their potential. So about 24, if you've followed the conversations about the global pay gap in the past several years, that has really gained some visibility. Women earn about 24% less than men. And at the current rate of progress, it could take almost 200 years to close the gap if we continue with the status quo. Women mainly work in the informal economy. So this means they have no legal protections. And so whether, women are simply taking care of family members, if they're running a small business and it's not registered or it's not formalized with, the local chambers of commerce, or they're not paying into government systems. For example, if they're not earning a wage income and paying into a government system that provides them access to a pension later in life, this means as they age, they do not have income protections that help them once they are unable to work anymore. And businesses, if they are not formalized, often don't have, they can't access certain programs that could help them expand those businesses, or they may not be able to have the same types of legal or just police protections because of their informal nature. Women work 2 to 10 times more in unpaid care work than men. They often call this the second shift, where women will work in an income generating activity during the day and then have several hours, anywhere between 3 and 4 extra hours a day, taking care of family, whether they get up earlier in the day or spend time later in the day helping children with homework, cleaning clothes, cooking and cleaning, etc. I think they've estimated that a young woman today will work on average the equivalent of 4 years more than a man over her lifetime when you incorporate the unpaid care taking that she does. And so ultimately this costs women about $9 trillion a year. So if you think about this amount of money in the pockets of women, there's such a huge potential for just growth in local economies if this amount of money was unlocked by figuring out how to better serve women and ensure that they're being paid for the work that they do at the same rate as men. And so if you'll go to the next slide, Kate. So what I'd like to do in this presentation is talk about 3 questions that Grameen is trying to answer when we think about the potential of the market that, that women, the purchasing power that they have and the important role that they play. The first question is, how do we engage men more effectively as champions and partners? The second one is how do we build sustainable networks of women agents to support entrepreneurship, financial inclusion, and agriculture production? And then finally, how do we identify risk to women and their families in the pursuit of positive impact while mitigating risk of doing harm? So I'm going to talk a little bit about each of these three questions in the following slides. So in the first slide, we'll talk about how do we engage men more effectively as champions and partners. For an organization like Grameen that's been working with women for decades, we've spent a lot of time designing products and services for women and trying to make sure that women can access those. But I think over time, both whether it's Grameen or just the broader sector, there have been much more intensive conversations about needing to pull back a little bit and think about how we find positive ways to engage men in this process, because of the lessons that we're learning that when you leave men out, you can actually have limited impact on women's lives because of the key role that men play in decision making, whether it's their father or their husband or brother or other family members that she may live with. So what we know right now, and some of the work that we're doing, is we've been working with a methodology called gender dialogues, where we're inviting men and women and community members and community decision makers into conversations to initiate difficult conversations. So whether these conversations are about family planning, which is a really taboo topic to talk about, with a husband or any other person, or whether it's talking about how to engage men in household nutrition decisions, or how to make decisions about how they will utilize their land so that women can actually grow some food crops for the household. Oftentimes, these conversations are very difficult for people to initiate because of the cultural norms that surround them. And so what we've learned is that people really appreciate when somebody comes in and creates that artificial moment. I often equate this to, if you're a parent, and that anxiety you have about when you're going to talk to your children about safe sex practices. You're always waiting for a right moment, and that right moment may never come along, and there can be some negative consequences from that. And so we, even in a project that we had around savings groups and family planning, we learned that both men and women were really appreciative of the fact somebody created space to initiate that conversation, because both desire to talk about it, but neither have the confidence or the tools to be able to initiate those conversations safely. And research is actually showing, for example, with a research study conducted in Cote d'Ivoire by another organization, that when you integrate these types of gender dialogues with savings groups, for example, that these strategies can actually reduce the risk of gender-based violence for women. And some of our own research that we conducted in Benin years ago, when we were testing out how you might engage men in village banking, we learned that when men were engaged with women's village banks, particularly when we were integrating health education into that strategy, that those groups that had men involved actually had better behavior change and better knowledge change compared to groups that were made up of women alone. However, there was a trade-off that in the women-only groups, they actually experienced more improved social capital and confidence. So we recognize that there are really important trade-offs that we have to think through. And part of the strategy, that we've been employing is really trying to come at these issues at different angles. So whether you create safe spaces for women to engage on certain topics, but you also make sure that you find a way to safely engage men in a conversation where both have the tools that they need to make the right decisions for their household. And we've also learned that men want an invitation to the table. And so one of the experiences we've had is men typically don't like to be involved in group-based, women's groups, for example, or group-based meetings, but they don't want to be intentionally left out. And so some of what we're thinking through is how do you make sure that they're invited, and when they do want to engage, that your strategy can integrate them into a productive conversation. And men also face challenges with social norms, or just these cultural norms that really, keep people locked into a particular way of living their lives. So for example, in Burkina Faso, some of the research that we've conducted, where we interviewed husbands and wives, separate from each other, you really see this tension where husbands want to be able to support their wives differently than maybe what their fathers did, but they can be perceived as being a weak man. And even women will ridicule men if they find that he's maybe helping his wife cook dinner, thinking that he's somehow or another bewitched by his wife, and which makes him weak. And so they're both kind of locked into this tug of war. So the quotation on the left is just an example of one of the reflections of our partners in Burkina Faso after we worked in a project where we integrated savings groups with nutrition and agricultural education, these gender dialogues to help them think through how they make decisions about their land and the crops that women wanted to grow for some of their own food security, access to agricultural financing, etc. The partners really reflected how important these gender dialogues and just savings groups themselves have really started to change some of these social and cultural norms, both for them as organizations as well as the people that they are serving. So if you'll go to the next slide, Kate. So on the second slide, and I'll spend a little bit more time here because this is where I'd like to talk a little bit about Joyce and Benedicta. So one of the strategies that we have at Grameen when we talk about agent networks is really trying to think through how do we leverage women as entrepreneurs to actually achieve many of the social objectives that we have to decrease poverty, improve people's livelihoods, et cetera. And so we kind of look at women agents as a 2-for-1 strategy where women, we're supporting them as entrepreneurs in their communities, but they're also serving their communities in a very critical way and extending services down to that last mile that's very difficult for organizational structures to do. So when you have women, working in their own communities, working through their own businesses and extending financial services, for example, or agricultural support to remote cocoa farmers, for example, you're supporting both her entrepreneurship, but you're also achieving some of these social objectives that you have. So what we know right now, kind of going back to the reflection about social norms earlier, is that the women entrepreneurs that we're trying to support with these, they face social norms constraints too. So we have to think really critically about how do you engage spouses so that when you're offering a business opportunity to a woman, how can you make sure that her husband buys into that he's supportive of her? She may have to make trade-offs at the household level and caretaking responsibilities. She may not have dinner ready at the same time that she used to, et cetera. And this, really clears the pathway for her to be really effective in her role. We've also learned that women are not transactional and they desire a relationship. They're not, and the global research shows this as well, that this is really a key insight about serving the women's market is that, number one, women can be better at customer service because they themselves desire kind of more of a relational transaction when they make purchases, when they decide who they want to buy or engage with the services that they're accessing. And that building trust is paramount. So technology can be really cool, but personal interactions are really important. So we often talk about this for kind of the concept of a high-tech, high-touch approach where, we're trying to engage, we're trying to provide the digital tools that help women entrepreneurs gain efficiencies in their businesses, making sure they can help people make financial transactions digitally, et cetera. But it's really that personal touch that makes that technology really functional and useful for people, especially given, where a lot of the places where Grameen works right now, that technology is still slowly being extended into those rural communities. So people are not able to do a lot of these transactions on their own. So on the left is another picture of Benedicta and Joyce. So Joyce, again, is the woman in the purple. She's the cocoa farmer. And when we met with her back in Ghana, she shared with me that, it wasn't too long ago that her husband had passed away and she had inherited her family's land. But in that inheritance, she shared that her husband had about approximately 10 acres of cocoa farming land. And in the dispute after her husband died, her extended family ended up taking over about 8 acres of that and leaving her with only 2 acres left despite her family, managing that land under her husband for years. And so he had been the one to work with our partner, Teuton, who was the cocoa buyer, for all of the decades that they had been cocoa farmers, but she was left to pick up the pieces, basically, and try to make something from the small amount of land that she was left. And Benedicta was the agronomist that came along to re-engage with her as the cocoa farmer that Teuton was going to support. And so when we met with Joyce, she had been, managing this farm for quite a while, and Benedicta had been spending time with her, trying to train her on the different good agricultural practices that she needed to practice on her farm to really bring it back to life, because it was struggling, both through her own grief, trying to kind of work through, managing a farm by herself, as well as just the fact that it wasn't in a very good state. And so when we were leaving, Benedicta shared with me that, how proud she was to see, the fruits, literally from the efforts of both of them, over the past year or two that they've been working together. And when we left Joyce's farm, I was in the car with Benedicta, and I was talking to her about her role as an agronomist, because I think she's one of 6 female agronomists that our partner has. And so there's very few of them that do this job. And I was asking her, what she likes and what she finds challenging about this job. And I think it's almost predictable. Number one, a lot of women don't like this type of work because it's hard. They're very long hours. They have to be on a motorcycle driving for hours out into really remote and rural areas to meet in person with farmers. And she also faces those constraints of she's young, and she has to work with farmers that are often twice her age, and she's bringing new information. She's bringing a technology to the relationship and trying to create value for them. And I was asking her, how does she feel, how she looks at her job maybe compared to her male colleagues. And, she shared that she has to spend a lot more time with them because she has to gain their trust. And she makes sure that the farmer is able to speak his or her mind. And so that she really sees this as a conversation, a trust building exercise. But she shares that, she feels like she gives farmers hope the more time that she spends with them. And she's also learning with them. She's been trained as an agronomist, but she recognizes these farmers have been farming for decades. And so she really has to find that balance of respecting and honoring the experience they have, but the new information that she brings to the table. So at the bottom of this slide is just a link to, there's actually a story about Joyce on the Grameen website. There's a video of her, and a little bit more about her story. She's the farmer that I thought if you had time after this webinar, you might enjoy going and watching that. So we can go to the next slide. Kate. So this last slide, I want to talk a little bit about the other kind of the flip side of what we're looking at is while we're aiming to do good, how can we make sure that we are mitigating the risks? So in the past several years, there's been a lot more acknowledgement in the sector that, while we're trying to do good, there are always risks that can be created along that journey. And so how do we make sure that, number one, we're asking the right questions so we know what those risks are? And then once we know what those risks are, how can we mitigate those? So years ago, the microfinance sector, for example, came up with client protection principles because there were real concerns about over-indebtedness. This is very similar in the sense that there are well-known risks within this, but the sector hasn't fully addressed things like the risk of increasing workplace safety issues or child labor, or the likelihood that a woman is going to face gender-based violence as she really tries to break out and start a business, which puts her in a different position of power within the household. And, her desire to have more control over her own income, et cetera, can really put her at risk. So some things that we know right now from some of the research that we've done, we have 2 projects right now that really are directly addressing these. One is called the Riches Project, and it's about reducing the incidences of child labor and workplace safety hazards within economic strengthening initiatives. And the other is called Women and Girls Empowered, and this is the one that looks at the risk of gender-based violence. So with these 2 projects, one thing that we've learned so far, and this is not a surprise, but it's an important finding that we have to think through quite a bit is, number one, women are labor constrained. So that means as they're small businesses, the income that those businesses bring in initially is really limited. So they can't hire people to help them in the business. And so they often turn to their children and families to actually work in those businesses. And they're the most trusted source of labor. And so as they're trying to work out their own kind of work-life balance issues, they're trying to find people to, help them in those businesses so that, while they may not be able to be there, or they may be working on a different task, somebody else is helping them in that income generating activity. And so most child labor across the world actually happens with children just working alongside their parents. And so within that project, the Riches Project, we're really just trying to think through how to give women entrepreneurs the tools to keep themselves and their children safe while they're trying to earn income for their families. The other thing that we know is that financial shocks push families into child labor, human trafficking, and even deeper poverty. And this is really an issue Grameen's worked on for a really long time, whether we've been working to develop health financing tools, linking clients to insurance products, et cetera. But this becomes very key because if we can solve some of these resilience issues and making sure that when income shocks happen at the household level, we can protect them, then we can really mitigate the risk of gender-based violence and child labor alike. Women's rise within the household challenges these social norms. So I touched on this a little bit, that as she gains a little bit of economic independence, this can really increase the risk of gender-based violence. And this usually happens when a woman initiates a business for the first time. And so we're really thinking about how can we mitigate those, make sure men and women are both, engaged in a conversation as she starts a new business. And we've also learned that you can mitigate child labor and gender-based violence. And part of this just starts out by, you have to ask the right questions. You have to acknowledge that these are risks so that you can actually think through how you design products and services and the delivery of those to ensure that they can, this can happen safely. And so I'll just end this slide with just a quick anecdote. When we conducted the Riches Project, kind of the human-centered design research several months ago, we were meeting with lots of women entrepreneurs, and this is just one quote from one of the women where she was sharing with us about her own experience where her parents really wanted her to go to school, but they sent her to live with somebody else where she could, take care of the house and the children in that family to earn money to go to school. And she reflected that she actually never was allowed to go to school during that time period. So these are real realities for the women that we serve. And so, we're really excited to see, once we start implementing some of these projects, like what are the new lessons we'll learn in engaging in a much smarter way going forward. And so on the last slide, as I was reflecting about kind of, what are the actions that, either Grameen or how we can personally take to really think about the theme for this year about Each for Equal, and really thinking about women's equality and the potential of the women's market. I just use this circle diagram to just reflect how, it starts with me. It starts with me understanding my own biases in the work that I do and how I see the world. And one of the approaches Grameen has taken over the past year is really to ensure that across the organization that we are conducting a power dynamics and gender training with all of our staff, so that we're all, looking at this with a new frame of reference for how we think about inter-household dynamics and social norms that, we may be able to improve and directly address within the work that we're doing. Grameen is, thinking with this kind of gender focus that we have about how can we make sure these products and services we're designing really respond to some of these social norms directly, so that we can better meet the needs of the women and the families that we're serving. When we think about our partners and the agent networks and the women entrepreneurs that we're also supporting, is how do we make sure we can identify strong business cases for serving women better, making sure they're better equipped in their own product and service delivery. And then finally, thinking about how we engage the community more directly around these gender dialogues, identifying male champions, improving collaboration, and maybe being creative about how we address these caretaking demands. It was not too long ago, somebody was talking about how, a new approach was taking about creating, using women's entrepreneurship as a way to open up childcare centers in preschool, providing a service to other, women in the community, et cetera. So there's a lot of interesting new innovations happening in this area. And so I will just end the presentation. I think that's my last slide. Just thanking you all for joining us today. And I look forward to any questions that any of you may have.
Bobbi, wow, thank you so much. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to type them in using the Q&A function on your screen now, and we'll go ahead and get to those right away. While they're coming in, I will just point out one thing Bobbi mentioned. We do have a brand new website at grameenfoundation.org, and there are a number of stories like Benedicta and Joyce's and some of the other women that Bobbi talked briefly about. You can watch videos and read a little bit more about their backgrounds and how some of this work that Bobbi's mentioned has been helping make a real difference in their lives. So please go to the new website and take a look. And we're still waiting for questions to come in. So I actually wondered while you were talking about this, Bobbi, I should know a little bit about this, but I wonder if you're so knowledgeable with this, depth and breadth of information that you were sharing with us today. Do you want to talk just really quickly about how you got into this work? I think that might be of interest to folks as well.
Sure. So I actually, I did my master's in international public administration and international development. And actually, at that time, one of my key professors was consulting for Freedom from Hunger, doing strategic planning. If you've ever run across Beryl Levenger, she's somebody who actually brought me into this work. I actually didn't think I would do international development because I was not living in a part of the world where this was really happening. I thought I'd work for the U.S. government, but then kind of fell into working on microfinance, back in the day when village banking and, all the work that Grameen had started, decades ago with the village banking was really kind of my start. And so it's really been quite a journey of learning a lot about agriculture in the past few years. I would say the learning around agriculture has been pretty intense, and it's been a lot of fun just living in a rural community myself and really reflecting on what farmers in the U.S. are doing and learning and, the business case they have for different technology innovations and how we think about those in, international development contexts. Yeah, so it's been, so I've learned a lot about health. I've learned a lot about agriculture, technology, obviously. So it's been quite an interesting journey.
Okay, thank you. And I know I didn't ask you to prepare that, so I appreciate you answering on the fly.
No, that's okay. I'm anticipating all sorts of questions I didn't prepare for.
Okay, great. We're starting to get a couple questions coming in. Do you see differences between countries that would suggest tailored programming, for each different country and culture, or are there also some solutions that are applicable globally?
I think there are really important differences that you have to take in consideration, but what's usually helpful is having some sort of framework that helps you think through where you might identify those differences. So I'll give you a very obvious example that just comes to mind. So in the Riches project that we're doing around, workplace safety and child labor, we have to create a global toolkit. And so we're testing this out in El Salvador and the Philippines, and they are very different countries. And one thing that, we learned as we were thinking about like the decision-making power of women in their businesses is that women in the Philippines actually have quite a bit of power. They tend to be money managers, in the household, whereas in El Salvador, women don't have a lot of decision-making power around finances, et cetera. And so this is just an example of where we can anticipate. We can't have a one-size-fits-all approach. We can have a framework that can be adapted. So for example, you might, in education design, make sure that, you can make an adaptation for relevant examples of a woman in a business may look very different in the Philippines or El Salvador, for example. So I think we work really hard to come up with flexible frameworks that can be adapted, but that just help us recognize what's similar and what's different, as we think about how, the different products and services that we're designing can move from, very different contexts. But I would say that there's a lot of similarity when you just think about, this idea that when you're thinking about women, that they tend to be labor constrained. They tend to still have social norm challenges about, concerns about their mobility, moving around the community, the perception that women should be at home, a woman speaking out may be frowned upon, et cetera. So a lot of things you can kind of anticipate, but you have to really think through and test those preconceptions you might have out to make sure that they're still valid as you move from one country to another.
Okay, thanks, Bobbi. Another question. You mentioned that women work in more informal roles, and can be less protected oftentimes. Are there any other steps that can be taken to improve some of this?
So part of it is I think you have to kind of look at it at different levels. So one thing that we've learned, and I'll take kind of the business, like formalizing a business perspective, is that formalizing a business can have its own pros and cons. So obviously one of the challenges of not formalizing a business is this constraint of you may not be protected, you may not have access to different types of services, et cetera. But then the second you formalize a business in certain countries, then you may lose access to things like microfinance, because the second they see you are formalized, they might assume that you're at a different income level. And so I think we just have to think about each country specifically, about what are the regulations and the, kind of that ecosystem, around the woman, so that we're clear on what the advantages and disadvantages are, and helping her understand what those are. A lot of times, women just lack the information of what is the benefit of formalizing a business? What are the costs? How do I do it? What paperwork do I have to fill out? That in and of itself is not an assumed capacity that, micro entrepreneurs may have. And so you can see opportunities just even starting at that level and helping take maybe complicated government processes and helping simplify those, or help, handhold a little bit to get them through that process. So I think in a lot of places, it's kind of contextually important to know what the particular barriers are. So in the Women and Girls Empowered initiative that we have that has this focused on gender-based violence, this is actually one of the first steps that we actually take across the different projects. We have 2 in El Salvador and Honduras, one that just started in Timor-Leste, and some coming up in Eswatini and Myanmar, where you actually go through, we have a framework that helps us think through all of the different dimensions, whether it's at that legal or regulatory level, the social norms, what does her financial access look like, so that you can figure out what the biggest lever of change is that you can address in each of those different contexts.
We have another question that goes back to, I think, that stat that really floored everyone, that was it would take 200 years to bridge the current pay gap. Are there any other ways that pay gap can be addressed globally or in specific communities?
So I think through, some of the partners that we're working with right now, I'm not so sure that in many of their cases, this concept has probably come up that often, because there aren't, I don't think there are really good standards of practice of what pay structures should look like at a, kind of as a get-go. So one of the things that we have been doing is trying to come up with standards of practice so that you can benchmark your organization against them, and it raises your awareness as to whether or not you actually have thought through whether the pay scales that you have for men and women are similar. I think that, one of the bigger challenges that comes up is whether the types of jobs that you're offering women are attractive to them. One of the partners has talked about they have very few women field agents. And when we know that female agents matter, out in the rural areas, you really have to think through some of these things, like their security. Part of the reason why some of the organizations in El Salvador don't have female agents is because they're worried about women traveling alone, when you've got gang violence and organized crime. And so, there there are many there are lots of challenges, that you have to kind of think through and figure out what, number one, how do you get women in positions or in comparable positions, that, put them at a similar pay scale as men, as well as actually making sure that the pay scales make sense and that if two people are doing the exact same job. So I think part of it is the sector. And, I think this is really kind of come to the forefront, even just in the US, more and more over the past several years. And so I think we're all on kind of a similar pathway of how do we all, whether it's in the United States or abroad, think about how, we can do this better, raise awareness and help people actually put those practices in place, to make sure. And so I think part of it's just both, the energy to do it and the leadership to do it. I think that's where, the gender training and the power dynamics training, that we're going to be doing with partners as well, because we feel they can't be good change agents at the community level if they themselves don't adhere to the same principles at the organizational level. And so I think, initiating a lot of those conversations is actually going to, do quite a bit, because they'll probably recognize that there's a lot of room for improvement in their own staff, much less, going to the community level and trying to, push on some of those levers of change around social norms.
And you just touched on this very briefly, talking about El Salvador. We have a question about, do we foresee or anticipate being able to add more female agents specifically in agriculture? So maybe you could also talk a little bit about, how the agent networks look differently in different cultures in different regions.
Sure. So, we have our financial services agent networks where there are women entrepreneurs, actually extending services into communities. And then we also have other types of networks where they are, actually employees of an organization, extending services into really rural communities. So I think, for Grameen, we look at agents as, they can kind of have different characteristics. But they all are similar in the sense that we're trying to equip people with the tools and the training and the support they need to work fairly independently, in rural communities, make sure that they can build trust with information, with services, et cetera. So when I think about agriculture, one of the things that, we have to acknowledge out the door is that women generally in agriculture are not recognized for the roles that they play. Men tend to be the ones that are perceived as the farmers. And a lot of times this is driven by land ownership. So if you don't own the land, you may not be you may not be the target that different agricultural companies or organizations, are seeking out. And if you don't own the land, and that tends to be women in a lot of cases, then they aren't targeted with agricultural support, et cetera. And so, we have to kind of look at it both from, bringing visibility to women's roles in agricultural value chains, for example, and then thinking through what's the right way to, bring that visibility to the forefront so that you can think through how to better, serve them in those communities. So I think we still have a lot of questions, and we're working very intensively around this particular issue right now, and trying to figure that out, because we also have to recognize that women may not want to be a primary decision maker on agriculture. I think even in the United States, you may have a husband and wife farming team, and he may still be the one doing most of the, the work on the farm, et cetera, but she may be doing the books, for example. And that may be, she may be completely fine with doing the books and doesn't necessarily want to have a greater role. So I think we have to just kind of make sure that we're balancing out women's desires, and preferences, along with our hopes and expectations, that we make sure that they're visible and that they're receiving the same type of support where they want it.
Great, thank you, Bobbi. And then we have two more questions that relate to your work in gender dialogues. First, can you speak a little bit more about your work in this area, how you work to kind of adjust some of the social norms, especially when looking at married couples and communities where there might be more issues around some of this? And then on the second part, can you talk a little bit about how we measure the impact of that work?
Mm-hmm. So right now, this methodology, it's fairly intense because you have to do quite a bit of preparation for it, both from just the logistical side of making sure that you have a male and female facilitator because of the fact you've got men and women, coming into a conversation. You want to make sure that there's really a male champion in those conversations so that, he might be able to push against some social norms, that he's very aware are going to influence a conversation. So we always make sure and aim to have a male and female facilitator in those. And then we think through, what are the things that we're not going to see change in if we don't help them have a conversation? This may sound kind of flippant, but it's not meant to be. A lot of this is really kind of marriage counseling, because men and women, I think even any of us can, relate to, getting married and trying to figure out, now we've combined our finances. What are our financial goals? Like, do we have different competing financial goals? So it's not an easy conversation. And there are lots of these not easy conversations. And so part of it is just thinking through how can you engage them in reflection, what they like, don't like about the current situation, and let them be the ones to come up with the solutions. Like what might they do differently, and why, and finding creative ways to help them see the other person's perspectives. And so I don't think it's very technically difficult. Part of it is just making sure that, you're creating the space for the conversations to happen. And I relate this, years ago, we had conducted, we had worked in India it was one of the first youth projects that we had, where we were engaging mothers and daughters in education around HIV/AIDS, for example. And I remember the feedback from the mothers when the project was over and we were evaluating it, how much they appreciated that we launched the conversation about HIV/AIDS because they were embarrassed and didn't feel well equipped to actually initiate the conversation with their children. And you see this pretty often when you do the gender dialogues, and how much people, basically talk about. I remember the family planning one that we had, where we were talking about contraceptives and making sure men and women had the same information. One of the men that we interviewed basically said, we know women's secret. Like, they don't think we know. They sneak to the clinic to seek out contraceptives, but we know their secret. And, women talking about how difficult it was trying to seek this out without their husbands knowing. And they both really craved having the conversation, but neither of them really knew how to initiate it. And then the question about the evaluating part of it, right now, for the most part, we've probably done this mainly qualitatively, because we want to understand like how they saw that conversation helping or hindering them. And so, for the most part, qualitatively, we get really good feedback on this. The other way that we've been doing it is obviously just looking at, women's perceptions of fear of their spouse. So we feel like if they feel more comfortable having complicated conversations, they might, be less concerned if they've had a positive experience in that. So, some of these gender dynamics are actually a little bit complicated to evaluate from a quantitative perspective, and it requires a lot of information to do that. But one way that we have been trying to consolidate that is by using the Women's Empowerment and Agricultural Index that got created by USAID years ago. And that's one way to kind of consolidate those lessons into a helpful index.
Okay, thank you. And one last question for you. Could you share, where you do some of your research, some of the sources that you use for all the stats you've provided about women in the global economy, maybe some websites for people to check out?
Sure. So one great website right now, Oxfam actually just put out a pretty significant study, maybe in January, and I'm happy to send links around and share it with you if you're going to communicate with people afterward. They have a nice study where they were looking at exactly a lot of this information um, that I just recently got published. So I think it's a great resource. Harvard Business Review. There are a lot of the World Bank puts out a lot of information on women in the economy that can also be shared. So there are really lots of resources out there. But I'm like many people, like it wasn't until recently I kind of started looking at these higher level, like global stats. They are staggering. And I think when you look at those, all of a sudden you're like, the business case is there just in the simple number, the 40 trillion dollars of consumer purchasing power. But yeah, those are the ones that come to mind. But there in a lot of the work that we've done, for example, on the Women and Girls Empowered, because we're creating this framework to do a lot of this desk review and have a lot of these stats. We've got a lot of different resources, whether it's from the World Bank. There's a great website called the Social Outcomes. I'm blanking on what it's called. The acronym is SIGI, and they actually have a lot of social norms information that they collect about every 5 years.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Bobbi. Thank you so much for leading us through this conversation. I think everyone is really energized and impassioned leading into International Women's Day.